I stepped through the front door of my childhood home after another brutal 10-hour shift installing drywall, my work boots caked with dust, and my lower back screaming for relief. The familiar scent of my mother's lavender air freshener should have been comforting, but something felt wrong immediately. Children's laughter echoed from upstairs, specifically from my bedroom. I climbed the wooden stairs 2 at a time, only to find my door locked with a brand new deadbolt. When I knocked, my sister Tracy's voice called out sweetly that they were busy. My mother Sandra appeared behind me, arms crossed, explaining matter-of-factly that she had given my room to Tracy and her 3 kids because they needed it more than I did. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. This was my space, the room I paid $800 monthly to occupy. Standing in that narrow hallway with paint chips scattered across the worn carpet, I felt the ground beneath my entire world shifting like quicksand. My mother's expression showed not a trace of guilt or uncertainty, just the cold practicality of someone who had already made peace with her decision. The children's voices behind the locked door grew louder, and I could hear furniture being rearranged, my belongings presumably shoved aside to make room for their chaos. The history of how I ended up here flooded back with painful clarity. When my father died suddenly of a heart attack during my junior year of high school, our family's financial foundation crumbled overnight. Dad had been the steady provider working at the paper mill for 22 years before his body gave out at age 49. Mom had been a part-time receptionist at a dental office, bringing in barely enough to cover groceries. Suddenly, she was facing a mortgage, utilities, insurance, and all the expenses of raising a teenager on her own. I picked up every odd job I could find. Weekends meant mowing lawns for neighbors. Evenings involved stocking shelves at the local grocery store, and summers were spent doing construction work with anyone willing to hire a scrawny 16-year-old. While my classmates worried about prom dates and college applications, I was calculating whether we could afford to keep the heat on through another winter. My grades suffered, but we survived. After graduating, I worked full-time construction while attending community college part-time, slowly earning my associate degree in business management. Those years were a blur of exhaustion, coffee, and textbooks studied by dim lamplight after 12-hour workdays. When I finally finished school at 25, I had saved enough for a decent apartment and was ready to start my adult life properly. That was when Mom called crying, explaining that her arthritis was getting worse, and she was struggling to maintain the house alone. Being the good son I had always been, I moved back home temporarily to help out. The arrangement seemed reasonable. I would pay rent to cover my share of expenses while helping with maintenance and repairs that were beyond her physical capabilities. $800 monthly seemed fair for a bedroom, shared kitchen, and bathroom access, plus the peace of mind that comes from knowing your aging parent is not struggling alone. What I had not anticipated was how quickly temporary would become permanent, or how my financial contributions would expand far beyond simple rent. The house built in 1978 demanded constant attention. Within my first year back home, the roof began leaking during a particularly harsh winter, creating brown stains across the ceiling of my childhood bedroom and threatening to damage the entire structure. The estimate for replacement was $12,000, money my mother simply did not have. I took out a personal loan and handled the entire project, from selecting materials to coordinating with contractors. The roof job led to discovering problems with the gutters, which led to foundation drainage issues, which revealed that the basement had been slowly flooding for years. Each repair uncovered new problems, and each solution came from my wallet. The HVAC system failed during a summer heat wave that pushed temperatures over 95 degrees for 8 consecutive days. Mom's health issues made the heat dangerous for her, so I arranged emergency financing for a complete system replacement. $8,000 disappeared from my savings account in a single afternoon, but the relief on her face when cool air finally flowed through the house made it worthwhile. The kitchen renovation came about gradually. First, the ancient refrigerator died, taking a week's worth of groceries with it. Then the dishwasher started leaking, warping the floor underneath. The stove had been temperamental for years with burners that worked sporadically and an oven that heated unevenly. Rather than continue patching problems individually, I decided to update the entire kitchen at once. $15,000 later, we had new appliances, updated electrical work to handle modern loads, fresh cabinets and countertops that did not harbor decades of stains and scratches. Mom was delighted with the transformation, posting pictures on social media and hosting friends for coffee to show off the beautiful space. I felt proud knowing my hard work had created something that brought her genuine happiness. My sister Tracy had been notably absent during all these improvements. She lived in a series of apartments across town, moving frequently due to various conflicts with landlords, roommates, or boyfriends. Her pattern was predictable: initial enthusiasm about a new living situation, followed by complaints about unfair treatment, leading to dramatic exits that usually involved missing rent payments or broken leases. She had 3 children by different fathers, none of whom provided consistent support, and worked sporadically at retail jobs that never seemed to last more than a few months. Tracy's relationship with our mother was complicated by constant financial requests. She needed money for car repairs, utilities about to be shut off, groceries for the kids, or security deposits for new apartments. Mom usually helped when she could, though I suspected much of that assistance came indirectly from my rent payments. I tried not to resent the arrangement, understanding that single motherhood was genuinely difficult, but Tracy's complete lack of financial planning or personal responsibility grew frustrating over time. The morning I discovered something was seriously wrong began like any other. I'd been working a large commercial project downtown, installing drywall in what would become a new office complex. The work was physically demanding but paid well, and I was proud of the quality craftsmanship my crew consistently delivered. My supervisor had been hinting about a possible promotion to lead a team of my own, which would mean better pay and more stable hours. I arrived home bone-tired and looking forward to a hot shower and dinner. Instead, I found mail scattered across the kitchen counter with my name prominently displayed on several official-looking envelopes. The first envelope contained a utility transfer notice informing me that the electricity account had been switched to my name and social security number 3 months earlier. The second envelope showed similar transfers for gas service and water. The third was a credit report inquiry apparently triggered by someone using my information to establish service accounts. My hands trembled as I opened each document. The signatures looked remarkably similar to my own handwriting, but I had no memory of signing anything related to utilities. The dates coincided with a week when I had been working overtime on a rush project and had barely been home except to sleep. Confronting my mother about the forged signatures led to tears and explanations about how she was trying to help me build credit history, how utility bills in my name would demonstrate financial responsibility to future lenders. Her reasoning made no sense, and her inability to meet my eyes while explaining suggested she knew exactly how inappropriate her actions had been. What troubled me more than the forgery itself was the realization that I was now legally responsible for all household expenses while she maintained control over how money was spent and who lived in the house. I was paying for everything but had no actual authority over decisions that affected my living situation. The final straw came when I walked into the garage to retrieve a tool and discovered garbage bags full of my personal belongings. Books I had collected over years, workout equipment I used regularly, and winter clothes I would need in a few months had all been carelessly stuffed into black plastic bags like trash headed for the curb. When I confronted my mother about this, she explained dismissively that Tracy needed space for the children's things, and my stuff was just taking up room unnecessarily. Standing in that garage looking at my possessions treated like garbage. While my sister's family took over the space I paid for, something fundamental shifted inside me. The woman who had raised me, who I had sacrificed years of my young adult life to support, saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of income with no rights or dignity worthy of respect. That realization cut deeper than any physical injury I had ever experienced on a construction site. The next morning, I woke before dawn with a sick feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with the leftover pizza I had eaten for dinner. Tracy's children were already awake in what used to be my room, their excited chatter about their new space carrying clearly through the thin walls. I lay on the uncomfortable couch where I had spent the night, my neck twisted at an awkward angle, and tried to process how quickly my living situation had deteriorated. After a quick shower and a cup of instant coffee, I decided to confront Tracy directly about the arrangement. I found her in the kitchen making breakfast for her kids, acting completely at home, as she scrambled eggs in the pan I had bought for the renovated kitchen. 8-year-old Emma sat at the table, coloring in a workbook, while 6-year-old Jake built elaborate structures with plastic blocks. 4-year-old Connor wandered around the room in his pajamas, occasionally climbing onto chairs to reach things that interested him. Tracy greeted me cheerfully as if nothing unusual had happened. When I asked about her plans for paying rent, her smile faded slightly, and she explained that Mom had assured her the arrangement would be temporary and that financial contributions were not expected. According to Tracy, our mother had presented this as an emergency solution to help her get back on her feet after her latest relationship ended badly. She had been living with a boyfriend named Marcus, who had become increasingly controlling and verbally abusive, particularly toward the children. The relationship had finally ended when Marcus threw Connor's toy truck across the room during a tantrum, nearly hitting Emma in the head. Tracy had packed what she could carry and left immediately, spending several nights in her car with the children before calling our mother for help. The story was genuinely heartbreaking, and I felt sympathy for the difficult situation she had faced. However, her assumption that I would simply absorb the financial burden of housing 4 additional people without discussion felt presumptuous and unfair. When I explained that I paid substantial rent for my bedroom and had not agreed to share the space, Tracy became defensive. She pointed out that I was single with no children, implying that my need for privacy and personal space was less legitimate than her need to provide stability for her kids. The conversation grew heated when I mentioned that adult decisions have consequences and that poor relationship choices should not become my financial responsibility. Tracy's defense was that family helps family, echoing the same phrase our mother had used the night before. She accused me of being heartless and selfish, suggesting that I cared more about money than the welfare of my own niece and nephews. The conversation ended with her storming out of the kitchen, taking the children with her, and leaving me alone with a sink full of dirty dishes and a growing sense of unease about the entire situation. Later that afternoon, while Tracy was out running errands with the kids, I decided to investigate the financial discrepancies that had been bothering me. I'd been contributing $800 monthly for rent, plus covering all utilities that were now mysteriously in my name, plus paying for repairs and improvements. My total monthly contribution to household expenses typically exceeded $1,500, yet the house was supposedly struggling financially. I began by gathering bank statements and receipts, organizing them chronologically to track where money had been going. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. My rent payments were being deposited into my mother's personal savings account rather than being used for household expenses. Over the 3 years I'd been living there, she had accumulated $36,000 from my rent alone, not including utility payments or money I had spent on repairs. Meanwhile, according to documents I found in her bedroom desk, she had been receiving various forms of government assistance based on claims that she lived alone and had no additional income sources. Housing assistance, food stamps, utility subsidies, and medical expense reimbursements were all predicated on financial need that did not actually exist. My contributions were being hidden from authorities while she collected benefits designed for people in genuine poverty. The discovery made me physically sick. Not only was I being financially exploited by my own mother, but she was committing fraud against programs intended to help people who truly needed assistance. The betrayal felt complete and devastating, attacking both my trust in family relationships and my basic sense of right and wrong. As I dug deeper into the financial deception, I discovered evidence of another layer to the manipulation. Text messages on an old phone she had left charging in the kitchen revealed ongoing communications with a man named Robert, whom she had apparently been dating for over a year. The conversations were affectionate and included discussions about their future plans together, including Robert's desire to move in with her once certain obstacles were removed. The obstacles that became clear from reading their exchanges were primarily me and the complications my presence created for their relationship. Robert was going through a contentious divorce and could not afford to have his living situation scrutinized by lawyers or investigators. My mother's government benefits could also be jeopardized if she was cohabiting with a romantic partner who had income. The solution they had devised was to find a way to get me out of the house permanently. The most painful text to read was one where my mother complained about how difficult it was to get me to leave, voluntarily describing me as stubborn and overly attached to a house that was not really mine. Robert's response suggested using Tracy's situation as leverage, proposing that housing his sister's family would create enough inconvenience and conflict to drive me away naturally. The plan was apparently working exactly as intended. That evening, I sat in the garage among the garbage bags containing my displaced possessions and tried to process the magnitude of what I had discovered. My mother, the woman who had taught me the importance of honesty and integrity, had been systematically lying to me, to government agencies, and to herself about the nature of our living arrangement. She had taken my financial contributions while simultaneously portraying me as a burden to others and working actively to remove me from a house I was essentially supporting. The betrayal went beyond mere money. She had manipulated my love and sense of family obligation, using my concern for her welfare as a weapon against my own interests. Every time I'd worried about her financial security, every repair I had funded, every sacrifice I had made for her comfort, had been based on lies designed to keep me trapped in a situation that benefited everyone except me. The sound of the front door opening announced the return of Tracy and the children. As I listened to their voices filling the house with the noise of family life, I realized that I was now completely alone in this situation. My mother saw me as an obstacle to remove Tracy, saw me as a selfish inconvenience, and the children were too young to understand the adult conflicts swirling around them. For the first time since my father's death, 13 years earlier, I felt completely without family support or allies. The following week brought a series of discoveries that revealed the true depth of my mother's deception and the calculated nature of her plan to remove me from the house. What I had initially interpreted as favoritism toward Tracy and poor judgment about family boundaries turned out to be part of a comprehensive strategy to eliminate my presence while maximizing financial gain from my years of contributions. The first bombshell came when I discovered real estate documents hidden behind other papers in my mother's bedroom filing cabinet. While she was at her weekly doctor's appointment and Tracy had taken the children to a playground, I used the opportunity to search for additional evidence of financial irregularities. What I found exceeded my worst fears about her intentions. The house had been professionally appraised 3 months earlier at a value of $420,000, representing a substantial increase from the $280,000 assessment when I had moved back home. The appraisal report specifically noted the high-quality improvements to the roof HVAC system, electrical service, and kitchen as major factors contributing to the property's enhanced value. My investments in the house had added $140,000 in equity, none of which would benefit me when the property was sold. The listing agreement with a local real estate agent was dated for the following month with an asking price of $435,000. The contract specified that proceeds from the sale would be split between my mother and Robert, who was apparently being added to the deed as a co-owner despite having contributed nothing to the property's value. Tracy was promised $20,000 from the sale proceeds as compensation for her cooperation in helping to remove me from the house. A separate document outlined their post-sale plans. My mother and Robert intended to purchase a smaller home in Florida, far from the complications of family obligations and government benefit investigations. They had already selected a retirement community near Tampa and placed a deposit on a 2-bedroom house with a screened porch and access to a golf course. The new property would be purchased entirely with proceeds from selling the house I had improved and maintained. The timeline for this plan was aggressive and already in motion. The real estate listing would go live within weeks, with an anticipated closing date before the end of summer. I was expected to be gone by then, either through voluntary departure or formal eviction proceedings that were already being prepared by a lawyer Robert had retained. My mother had no intention of giving me advance notice or an opportunity to negotiate alternative arrangements. The psychological warfare began escalating immediately after Tracy moved in with her children. The house rules changed daily, always in ways that made my presence more uncomfortable and inconvenient. My designated shower time was reduced to 15 minutes in the early morning before the children needed to get ready for school. Kitchen access was limited to specific hours when I would not interfere with Tracy's meal preparations or the children's activities. My mother began changing locks throughout the house, starting with cabinets where I had previously stored personal items, then progressing to the basement where I kept tools and workout equipment. When I asked for keys to access my own belongings, she explained that the children's safety required limiting access to potentially dangerous areas. The implication that I posed a threat to my own niece and nephews felt like another deliberate insult designed to justify increasingly hostile treatment. The mail situation became particularly vindictive. Despite my name being on utility accounts and various financial documents, my mother began intercepting mail addressed to me and disposing of items she deemed unimportant. Important communications from my bank, insurance company, and employer were delayed or lost entirely. When I confronted her about this, she claimed to be trying to reduce clutter and suggested that I should establish my own mailing address if I wanted complete control over my correspondence. Tracy's children, innocent victims in this adult conflict, began treating me like a stranger in what had been my home for 3 years. They had been told that I was a temporary guest who would be leaving soon, which explained their lack of concern about taking over my space or disrupting my routines. 8-year-old Emma started asking when I would be moving out so they could have more room for their things. 6-year-old Jake complained that I was too loud when I came home from work late, even though I made every effort to be quiet. The most heartbreaking loss was the disappearance of my father's military service medals and flag, which had been displayed in a shadow box in my bedroom. When I asked my mother about these irreplaceable mementos, she claimed not to know what had happened to them, suggesting that they might have been accidentally thrown away during the room changeover. The casual dismissal of items that represented my father's sacrifice and service felt like the ultimate betrayal of family memory and values. Robert began staying overnight regularly, marking his territory like an animal claiming a new den. He left his toiletries in the main bathroom, hung his clothes in the front closet, and gradually moved his belongings into spaces throughout the house. His presence was clearly intended to intimidate me and demonstrate that my time there was limited. He spoke to me with barely concealed hostility, making comments about grown men who lived with their mothers and the importance of personal responsibility and independence. The breaking point came when I discovered eviction notice papers being prepared in consultation with Robert's lawyer. Despite my name being on utility accounts and having established residency through rent payments, they intended to claim that I was merely a guest whose welcome had expired. The legal strategy relied on my mother's assertion that our arrangement was informal and that I had no legitimate tenancy rights despite 3 years of documented payments. The eviction papers painted me as an ungrateful son who had been allowed to live rent-free in his childhood home but had become disruptive and threatening toward other family members. They claimed that my presence endangered the welfare of Tracy's children and prevented my mother from making necessary decisions about her own property. The document was filled with lies and distortions designed to make me appear unreasonable and potentially dangerous. Reading those papers while sitting on my childhood bed, surrounded by boxes of a little girl's toys, where my own belongings used to be, I realized that my mother had completely written me out of her life story. In her version of events, I was not the son who had sacrificed his young adult years to support her, who had funded tens of thousands of dollars in home improvements, or who had worked multiple jobs to keep our family afloat after Dad's death. I was simply an obstacle to be removed through whatever legal and emotional manipulation proved necessary. That night, I barely slept as I wrestled with the magnitude of my situation. Everything I had worked for, every sacrifice I had made, every dollar I had invested in keeping our family together was being used against me by the person I had trusted most in the world. The house I had improved and maintained was being sold without my consent or benefit, while I was being portrayed as the problem preventing everyone else from moving forward with their lives. The family gathering, that would become my public humiliation, was scheduled for my grandmother's 82nd birthday, a celebration that had been planned for months before the current crisis erupted. Grandma Helen was my father's mother, a sharp-minded woman who had always treated me with fairness and genuine affection. The party would include aunts, uncles, and cousins from both sides of the family, many of whom I had not seen in years due to work obligations and geographical distance. My mother spent days preparing for the event, cleaning the house obsessively and cooking elaborate dishes that would showcase the beautiful kitchen I'd renovated. She seemed excited about hosting the celebration and particularly eager to show off the improvements that had transformed the house since our last major family gathering. I wondered if any of the relatives would realize that every upgrade they admired had been funded by my labor and savings. Tracy threw herself into party preparations with matching enthusiasm, decorating the dining room with balloons and streamers, while her children made handmade cards for their great-grandmother. The house filled with the warm scents of roast beef, fresh rolls, and the coconut cake that had been Grandma's favorite for decades. Despite the tension of recent weeks, the atmosphere felt temporarily normal as we prepared to welcome family members we all loved and missed. The first relatives arrived early Saturday afternoon, Uncle Frank and Aunt Carol, along with my cousins Jessica and Michael. Frank was my father's younger brother, a successful contractor who had always been supportive of my career in construction. Jessica, 26, worked as a marketing coordinator for a local tech company and maintained an active social media presence documenting her professional achievements and travel adventures. Michael, 24, was finishing his master's degree in engineering and had recently gotten engaged to his college girlfriend. The initial conversations were pleasant and familiar. Frank asked about my current projects and seemed impressed when I described the downtown office complex where I'd been working. Jessica showed me photos from a recent vacation to Costa Rica, and Michael discussed his thesis research on renewable energy systems. For a brief moment, I felt like a valued member of the family participating in normal social interactions. Additional relatives continued arriving throughout the afternoon. Aunt Patricia and Uncle David came from 2 hours away, bringing their teenage sons, Ryan and Tyler. Cousin Amanda drove down from the state capital with her husband Brian and their 2 young daughters. By dinner time, 16 family members had gathered around the expanded dining table, creating the kind of multi-generational celebration that had been common during my childhood but rare in recent years. The trouble began during dinner, when Uncle Frank made a casual comment about how nice the house looked with all the recent improvements. He complimented the kitchen renovation and mentioned that the new roof had clearly been a smart investment, given the harsh winter weather we had experienced. My mother accepted the praise, graciously describing the challenges of maintaining an older home and the importance of staying current with necessary repairs. When Frank asked who had handled the renovation work, my mother hesitated for just a moment before crediting local contractors and her own careful planning. She made no mention of my financial contributions or the personal loans I had secured to fund the projects. Tracy chimed in to support this narrative, praising our mother's good judgment and her ability to manage complex home improvement projects despite her limited income. I remained silent during this exchange, not wanting to create conflict during Grandma's celebration, but my discomfort must have been visible. Cousin Jessica, always observant of social dynamics, asked directly whether I had been involved in the renovation decision since I lived in the house. This innocent question created an opening for my mother to launch into her carefully prepared character assassination. According to my mother's version of events, I'd been living in the house rent-free for 3 years, while contributing nothing to household expenses or maintenance costs. She described me as increasingly selfish and demanding, expecting her to provide free housing while I saved money for my own future plans. The renovation project, she claimed, had been funded through her own savings government assistance programs and help from Robert, whose involvement in our family she was now acknowledging publicly for the first time. Tracy supported this narrative enthusiastically, adding details about how my presence had become disruptive to her children's adjustment to their new living situation. She described me as resentful about sharing space and unwelcoming toward kids who had nowhere else to go after escaping an abusive relationship. According to Tracy, I had been making unreasonable demands about privacy and personal space while showing no concern for the welfare of vulnerable family members. The relatives absorbed this information with varying degrees of surprise and disappointment. Uncle Frank, who had always respected my work ethic and dedication to family, looked genuinely shocked to hear that I had been taking advantage of my mother's generosity. Cousin Jessica immediately began taking notes on her phone, apparently planning to share this family drama with her online followers. The younger cousins exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering their previous positive impressions of my character and life choices. When I attempted to defend myself by mentioning my rent payments and financial contributions, my mother dismissed these claims as exaggerations and distortions. She produced bank statements showing deposits into her account, but explained these as loan repayments for money she had advanced to help me through various financial difficulties over the years. The documentation appeared to support her story, though it actually represented creative accounting designed to obscure the true nature of our financial relationship. Uncle Frank, clearly uncomfortable with the family conflict, but feeling obligated to address what seemed like serious character issues, offered to help me find alternative housing. He suggested that I could sleep on the couch in his spare room until I got my act together and found a place of my own. The offer was made with good intentions, but felt like confirmation that my extended family now viewed me as a charity case requiring intervention and support. Cousin Jessica took the opportunity to record part of the confrontation on her phone, later posting it to her social media accounts with commentary about entitled millennials who refused to take responsibility for their own lives. The video showed me attempting to explain my side of the story, while my mother and sister presented a united front of reasonable adults dealing with a difficult family member. Without context about the financial manipulation and legal deceptions, I appeared petulant and defensive. The birthday celebration continued around this drama, but the atmosphere had been permanently altered. Grandma Helen looked distressed by the family conflict, though she remained diplomatically silent about the competing narratives. Other relatives made polite conversation about safer topics, but I could sense them watching me with new suspicion and judgment. The respect and affection I had earned through years of hard work and family dedication had been destroyed in a single evening through my mother's strategic lies. The final insult came when my mother announced that I would need to move out by the end of the month to make room for Robert, who would be helping her manage the house and providing stability for Tracy's children. This news was presented as a reasonable transition that would benefit everyone involved, particularly the kids who needed consistency and security in their living environment. The timeline was non-negotiable, and formal eviction proceedings would begin if I failed to comply voluntarily. As the evening wound down and relatives prepared to leave, several of them approached me individually to express concern and offer advice. The conversations were well-meaning, but based on completely false information about my character and circumstances. Uncle Frank reiterated his offer of temporary housing while encouraging me to develop better financial habits and a more cooperative attitude toward family obligations. Cousin Amanda suggested that I might benefit from counseling to address what appeared to be entitlement issues and difficulty accepting adult responsibilities. The most painful conversation was with Grandma Helen, who pulled me aside as she was preparing to leave. She looked tired and sad as she acknowledged that family relationships could be complicated and that sometimes people saw the same situations very differently. Her diplomatic words suggested that she suspected there was more to the story than what had been presented publicly, but she felt powerless to intervene in conflicts between her adult children and grandchildren. After everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the living room, while my mother and Tracy cleaned up the party debris. They chatted happily about how well the evening had gone and how nice it had been to host such a large family gathering. Robert, who had attended as my mother's official boyfriend, helped with kitchen cleanup while making comments about the importance of family unity and moving forward from past conflicts. That night, lying on the couch that had become my permanent sleeping arrangement, I realized that my reputation within the extended family had been destroyed beyond repair. Even if I eventually proved that my mother's accusations were false, the damage to relationships that had taken decades to build could never be fully undone. Jessica's social media posts would preserve this version of events permanently, creating a public record of my alleged failures as a son and family member. The psychological impact of that evening was devastating in ways that went beyond mere embarrassment or frustration. I had been systematically erased from my own family story, replaced with a fictional character whose selfishness and ingratitude justified whatever treatment he received. The people who should have known me best had accepted lies about my character without question, apparently finding it easier to believe the worst about me than to investigate the situation more carefully. The weeks following my public humiliation at Grandma's birthday party marked a turning point in my approach to the escalating family crisis. Rather than continuing to react emotionally to each new betrayal or manipulation, I decided to channel my anger and hurt into systematic preparation for what was beginning to feel like an inevitable confrontation. The time for hoping that reason and family loyalty would prevail had clearly passed. My first call was to my friend Danny Rodriguez, whom I had known since high school and who had recently finished law school and passed the bar exam. Danny was working for a small firm that specialized in real estate and contract disputes, gaining experience with exactly the kind of legal issues that were consuming my life. We met for coffee on a Sunday morning when he was free from work obligations, and I laid out the entire situation as objectively as I could manage. Danny listened carefully as I described the financial arrangements, the forged signatures on utility transfers, the home improvements I had funded, and the real estate sale documents I'd discovered. He took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about documentation timelines and the legal basis for various claims my mother might make about our living arrangement. His expression grew increasingly serious as he realized the complexity and potential criminality of what I was describing. The legal analysis Danny provided was both encouraging and sobering. On the positive side, I had substantial documentation of my financial contributions to the house, including canceled checks, bank statements, and receipts for major purchases. The utility accounts in my name, despite being established through forged signatures, actually supported my claim to legitimate residency rather than undermining it. Most importantly, the permits and contracts for major home improvements were filed in my name, creating a legal basis for claiming ownership of those specific upgrades. The concept that proved most relevant was something called contractors' lien rights, which Danny explained could apply even when the person paying for improvements was not the property owner. because I had paid for the roof replacement, HVAC installation, electrical upgrades, and kitchen renovation. I potentially had legal claims to remove those improvements if the underlying arrangements were found to be fraudulent or unconscionable. However, Danny also warned me about the challenges I would face in pursuing legal remedies. Family disputes involving property and money were notoriously difficult to resolve quickly, and the emotional toll of extended litigation could be devastating regardless of the eventual outcome. The forgery issues might constitute criminal fraud, but prosecuting family members was complicated both legally and personally. The government benefit fraud was a separate matter that could result in serious legal consequences for my mother, but pursuing that avenue would likely destroy any possibility of family reconciliation. After consulting with his supervising attorney, Danny helped me develop a comprehensive documentation strategy. We needed to preserve evidence of all financial transactions, communications, and legal documents before my mother realized I was preparing for potential legal action. The goal was to build an irrefutable record of the true financial relationship and the deceptive practices that had been used to exploit my contributions. I began systematically photographing and copying every relevant document I could access in the house. Bank statements, utility bills, receipts for home improvements, government assistance paperwork, and communications between my mother and Robert were all carefully documented and stored in multiple locations. I opened a safe deposit box at a different bank to ensure that critical evidence would remain secure regardless of what happened to my living situation. The most damaging discovery came when I gained access to my mother's email account through a password she had written on a note stuck to her computer monitor. Her correspondence with Robert revealed the full scope of their planning and the calculated nature of their manipulation of both me and government agencies. Screenshots of these communications provided clear evidence of intent to commit fraud and conspiracy to deprive me of legitimate property interests. One particularly revealing email chain discussed the optimal timing for listing the house and the importance of removing me before potential buyers began conducting inspections. Robert expressed concern that my presence during showings might lead to awkward questions about the property's improvements and who had actually paid for them. My mother agreed that a clean break from family complications would make the sale process smoother and more profitable. While gathering evidence, I also began making practical preparations for my eventual departure from the house. I researched apartment rentals in areas with reasonable commutes to current and potential job sites, comparing costs and amenities to determine what I could afford on my construction worker salary. The process was depressing as I realized that starting over would mean accepting much lower living standards than I had enjoyed while contributing to the family home. I opened a new bank account at a different financial institution and began redirecting my direct deposit paycheck to ensure that my mother could not access or manipulate my income. This change required careful timing to avoid arousing suspicion before I was ready to implement broader changes to my situation. I also updated my mailing address to a post office box, providing a secure location for receiving sensitive communications about legal and financial matters. The storage unit rental was handled discreetly during lunch breaks from work. I selected a climate-controlled facility, large enough to accommodate furniture and personal belongings, paying several months in advance to avoid potential complications if my income situation changed. The facility's 24-hour access would allow me to move belongings gradually without creating obvious signs of preparation. During this period, my mother and Robert became increasingly bold about their plans and their treatment of me. They began bringing real estate agents through the house for preliminary assessments, introducing me to visitors as a temporary guest who would be leaving soon. Robert started using my bathroom toiletries and eating food I had purchased, establishing dominance through small but persistent violations of my personal space and property. Tracy's attitude toward me shifted from defensive to openly hostile as she realized that my departure would benefit her family's security in the house. She began making complaints to our mother about alleged inappropriate behavior toward her children, claiming that I made them uncomfortable through excessive attention or criticism of their activities. These accusations were completely fabricated, but served to create additional justification for removing me from the household. The children themselves were being systematically turned against me through subtle manipulation and direct lies about my character and intentions. 8-year-old Emma started avoiding eye contact and refusing to respond when I spoke to her. 6-year-old Jake began telling elaborate stories about how I had threatened or frightened him, accounts that bore no resemblance to our actual interactions, but were eagerly believed by the adults who wanted to vilify me. Most painfully, I discovered that my mother had been intercepting mail from Grandma Helen, who had apparently been trying to reach me privately after the birthday party confrontation. Several letters expressing concern about family conflicts and offering support had been hidden in my mother's bedroom, preventing me from receiving the only sympathetic communication from my extended family. One evening in mid-June, while organizing documents in the storage unit, I found myself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was preparing to do. Walking away from my family home meant accepting that the relationships that had defined my entire life were beyond repair. The house where I had grown up, where my father had taught me to throw a baseball and change a tire, would be sold to strangers who would never know the history embedded in its walls. But I also felt a growing sense of empowerment as my preparations progressed. For the first time in months, I was taking control of my situation, rather than simply reacting to other people's manipulations and betrayals. The evidence I was gathering would allow me to tell the true story of our financial arrangements, and the legal strategies Danny had outlined provided concrete alternatives to continued victimization. The final piece of preparation involved timing the revelation of my legal position and the implementation of my departure strategy. Danny advised waiting until my mother had committed more fully to the real estate sale process, making it difficult for her to reverse course when she realized the complications my claims would create. The goal was to maximize the impact of my response while minimizing the opportunity for additional manipulation or retaliation. As summer began and the house sale preparations intensified, I felt ready to execute a plan that would finally assert my rights and dignity while escaping a situation that had become psychologically and financially unsustainable. The scared and confused young man who had been blindsided by his family's betrayal was transforming into someone capable of strategic thinking and decisive action. Whatever happened next, I would face it on my own terms with legal backing and careful preparation. The morning of my departure arrived with the kind of perfect clarity that sometimes follows weeks of storm clouds. I had scheduled 3 days of vacation from work, telling my supervisor I needed to handle some family matters that required my full attention. The moving company trucks were scheduled to arrive at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, followed by specialized contractors who would begin the process of reclaiming the property improvements that legally belonged to me. My mother had taken Tracy's children to a doctor's appointment in town, a routine visit I had learned about through careful observation of the family calendar. Robert was at his own apartment dealing with divorce paperwork, giving me a window of several hours to begin the process without immediate interference or confrontation. The timing was essential, as Danny had warned me that any attempt to prevent lawful removal of my property could result in additional legal complications for everyone involved. The first truck to arrive belonged to Martinez Moving Company, a family-owned business that had handled relocations for several of my construction colleagues over the years. The crew chief, Carlos Martinez, was someone I had worked with on a commercial project the previous year, and he understood the sensitive nature of the current situation. His team would remove my personal belongings quickly and efficiently while treating the process with appropriate professionalism and discretion. The second vehicle was a specialized equipment truck from Advanced HVAC Services, the same company that had installed the heating and cooling system 3 years earlier. Danny's research had confirmed that the system had been purchased and installed under my name, making me the legal owner despite its integration into the house structure. The removal would require several hours of careful work to disconnect units, seal openings, and ensure that basic climate control remained functional through temporary window units. Kitchen Specialists Incorporated arrived 30 minutes later with a crew trained in appliance removal and cabinet reconfiguration. The dishwasher, refrigerator, stove, and microwave that had transformed my mother's cooking capabilities were all documented purchases made with my credit cards and bank loans. The removal process would leave basic electrical connections intact, but would require significant adjustment to the kitchen's functionality and aesthetic appeal. The water heater removal was handled by Thompson Plumbing, whose owner had been the original installer when the old unit failed during my second year in the house. The replacement process would involve installing a smaller basic unit sufficient for the reduced household size that would result when Tracy and her children were eventually forced to find alternative housing arrangements. As the contractors began their systematic work, I walked through each room of the house, documenting the process with photographs and video recordings. The evidence would be crucial if legal challenges arose later, but the documentation also served a personal purpose in helping me process the magnitude of what I was reclaiming. Every item being removed represented not just financial value, but years of my labor and sacrifice that had been taken for granted or actively exploited. The HVAC removal proved most complex, requiring access to ductwork in the basement and attic spaces. The outdoor condenser unit sat on a concrete pad that I had poured specifically for the installation, making its removal straightforward once electrical connections were safely disconnected. Inside the house, the furnace and air handler were extracted through the basement entrance, leaving rectangular openings in walls that had been carefully modified to accommodate the equipment. Window air conditioning units were installed in key rooms to provide minimal climate control during summer heat, but the capacity was dramatically reduced compared to the whole house system that had been removed. The bedroom where Tracy's children slept would be particularly uncomfortable as it faced west and received intense afternoon sun that had previously been managed by central air conditioning. Kitchen appliance removal created the most visually dramatic transformation. The gleaming stainless steel refrigerator was replaced with an ancient unit borrowed from the basement that barely maintained proper temperatures and made grinding noises throughout its cooling cycles. The smooth-top electric stove was replaced by a 2-burner hot plate that would make preparing meals for 5 people nearly impossible. The dishwasher removal left an empty cabinet opening that was temporarily covered with plywood. The electrical panel replacement was handled by Hoffman Electric, the same company that had upgraded the house's electrical service to handle modern appliances and air conditioning loads. The new central air system had required significant electrical work, including upgraded wiring and a larger capacity panel box. Removing the upgraded components meant returning to the original 60-amp service that had been adequate for 1970s electrical needs but was insufficient for contemporary household demands. As each major system was removed or downgraded, the house began to feel like a different place entirely. Rooms that had been comfortable and modern started feeling cramped and outdated. The kitchen, which had been my mother's pride and joy during family gatherings, now looked like something from a low-budget rental property. The absence of central air conditioning made the entire house feel stuffy and warm even in the mild June weather. My personal belongings were packed and loaded with equal efficiency. Furniture, clothing, books, tools, and electronics filled the moving truck systematically as Carlos's crew worked through my comprehensive inventory list. Items that had been displaced to the garage were retrieved and included ensuring that nothing of value would be left behind to be discarded or claimed by others. The process attracted considerable attention from neighbors who gathered in small groups to observe the unusual level of activity. Mrs. Patterson from next door approached Carlos to ask whether the house was being sold, expressing surprise that she had not been informed of any real estate transactions. Her questions revealed that my mother had not yet disclosed her plans to the community, suggesting that the sale timeline was more aggressive than what neighbors had been led to expect. By early afternoon, the transformation was complete, and the contractors were finishing their cleanup and system testing procedures. The house remained structurally sound and legally habitable, but it had been fundamentally altered in ways that would affect every aspect of daily life for the remaining occupants. The comfortable modern home that had hosted family gatherings and impressed relatives was now a basic shelter with minimal amenities and reduced capacity. I was reviewing final paperwork with the moving crew when my mother's car pulled into the driveway. The sight of multiple commercial vehicles and workers carrying items out of the house caused immediate panic and confusion. Tracy jumped out of the passenger seat and ran toward the front door, shouting questions about what was happening and demanding explanations from contractors who had been instructed to refer all inquiries to me or my legal representative. My mother approached me with a mixture of anger and disbelief, demanding to know what I thought I was doing and threatening to call police to stop what she characterized as theft and vandalism. I handed her a legal document Danny had prepared that outlined the basis for my property claims and the procedures I had followed to ensure lawful removal. The document also informed her of my immediate vacation of the premises and termination of all financial contributions to household expenses. Reading the legal notice seemed to drain the color from my mother's face, as she realized the scope of what was happening and the careful planning that had made it possible. Robert arrived minutes later and immediately began taking photographs of the contractors and their vehicles, apparently believing he could use evidence of the removal process to support legal action against me. His threats and bluster were ignored by the professional crews, who continued their work according to predetermined schedules. Tracy's children stood in the driveway looking confused and upset by the chaos and adult conflict surrounding them. 8-year-old Emma asked repeatedly why strangers were taking things from their house, while 6-year-old Jake cried because the toys he had left in the kitchen were disrupting the appliance removal process. 4-year-old Connor clung to his mother's leg, overwhelmed by the noise and unfamiliar activity. The final item to be removed was my father's shadow box, containing military medals and flag, which I had discovered hidden in my mother's closet during one of my evidence-gathering sessions. Retrieving these irreplaceable mementos felt like reclaiming not just property, but family history and personal identity that had been denied to me. The relief of having them safely in my possession was almost overwhelming. As the last contractor finished loading equipment and drove away, I stood on the front lawn looking at the house where I'd grown up and where I'd invested so much of my adult life and resources. The structure looked the same from the outside, but I knew that everything inside had been fundamentally changed. My mother and Robert would now experience the true costs of homeownership without the financial buffer my contributions had provided for 3 years. The drive away from my childhood home felt simultaneously liberating and heartbreaking. In the rearview mirror, I could see my mother standing in the driveway with her arms crossed, while Tracy tried to comfort her crying children. Robert was on his phone, presumably calling lawyers or authorities who might reverse what I had accomplished. But all the legal documentation was proper, and all the property removals were legitimate under the contractor's lien rights Danny had researched. That evening, in my new apartment across town, I sat among boxes of belongings and tried to process what I had accomplished and what it meant for my future. The apartment was smaller and less luxurious than the bedroom I'd occupied in my family home, but it was entirely mine, and free from the manipulation and conflict that had poisoned my previous living situation. For the first time in months, I felt peaceful and secure in my own space. The aftermath of my strategic departure unfolded over the following months, with a satisfaction that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. The immediate impact was obvious within days, as the house became nearly uninhabitable during the summer heat wave that struck our region in early July. Without central air conditioning, interior temperatures reached the upper 80s, even with window units running constantly, making sleep difficult and daily activities uncomfortable for everyone remaining in the house. The kitchen situation proved even more problematic than I had anticipated. Preparing meals for 4 people using a two-burner hot plate, and the ancient replacement refrigerator turned every breakfast, lunch, and dinner into a logistical nightmare. Tracy found herself spending hours each day on food preparation that had previously taken minutes while the children complained constantly about the heat and the disruption to their routines. Within 2 weeks, my mother began receiving calls from local utility companies about overdue bills that I was no longer covering. The electric bill alone jumped by $300 monthly as the inefficient window units ran continuously in an attempt to maintain bearable temperatures. Water costs increased as well since the replacement water heater was less efficient and required more energy to provide adequate hot water for daily needs. The real estate agent my mother had hired to sell the house was forced to delay the listing indefinitely once she learned about the recent property modifications. The removal of major appliances and systems created disclosure requirements that would significantly impact both the sale price and the pool of potential buyers. Most concerning was the fact that the house no longer matched the recent appraisal that had estimated its value at $420,000. Robert's enthusiasm for the relationship and their shared future plans diminished rapidly as he experienced the reality of living in a house without modern conveniences during the hottest summer on record. His romantic vision of moving in with my mother had not included sleeping in stifling heat or preparing meals on a hot plate that barely functioned. The financial obligations he had agreed to share suddenly seemed much more burdensome when combined with the costs of making the house livable again. The situation became critical in early August, when Tracy's youngest child, 4-year-old Connor, was treated at the emergency room for heat exhaustion after spending a particularly hot afternoon in the poorly ventilated house. The medical incident forced my mother to acknowledge that the living conditions were potentially dangerous for young children and that immediate action was required to address climate control issues. However, the cost estimates for replacing the HVAC system, kitchen appliances, and electrical upgrades exceeded $30,000 money that my mother no longer had access to since Robert was reconsidering their financial partnership. The savings account that had accumulated my rent payments over 3 years was insufficient to cover both living expenses and major home repairs, especially with utility costs consuming hundreds of dollars monthly. Robert officially ended their relationship and moved out permanently after receiving divorce papers that included detailed financial disclosures about his living arrangements and income sources. His lawyer had advised that cohabitation with someone receiving government assistance could complicate his divorce settlement and potentially expose him to fraud allegations. The dream of relocating to Florida together evaporated as quickly as it had been formed. In September, Tracy was forced to leave the house with her children after the school district questioned whether their registered address provided adequate living conditions for elementary-age students. The combination of excessive heat-limited cooking facilities and overcrowded sleeping arrangements raised concerns about child welfare that Tracy could not afford to ignore. She reluctantly moved back in with her ex-boyfriend Marcus, accepting his controlling behavior as preferable to homelessness. My mother, now living alone in the deteriorating house, began experiencing the full weight of financial and practical consequences that my departure had created. Without Robert's promised support or Tracy's assistance with daily tasks, she struggled to maintain even basic household functions. The government benefit programs she had been exploiting were also under investigation following anonymous tips about unreported income and fraudulent applications. In October, I received the phone call I had been expecting for weeks. My mother's voice was barely recognizable as she tearfully explained that the house was entering foreclosure proceedings and that she desperately needed help to avoid losing everything. The months of missed mortgage payments combined with utility debts and the costs of emergency repairs had created financial obligations she could not meet independently. Her request for assistance was accompanied by apologies and acknowledgments that she had made serious mistakes in how she had handled our family relationships and financial arrangements. For the first time since the crisis began, she admitted that my contributions had been substantial and that my departure had revealed how dependent the household had become on my income and support. However, her apologies remained focused on tactical errors rather than fundamental violations of trust and integrity. She expressed regret about the timing of her decisions and the communication problems that had led to misunderstandings, but she did not acknowledge the deliberate deception, financial exploitation, or character assassination that had defined her behavior. The request for help came with implicit expectations that I would resume my previous role as financial supporter without addressing the underlying issues that had created our conflict. My response was measured and final. I explained that I was willing to maintain a limited relationship with appropriate boundaries, but that financial entanglement and shared living arrangements were permanently off the table. The trust required for those arrangements had been destroyed through her choices, and my own financial security required protecting myself from future exploitation. I also informed her that I had shared documentation of the government benefit fraud with appropriate authorities not out of vindictiveness, but because continued silence would make me complicit in ongoing criminal activity. The investigation was already underway, and cooperation with authorities might help minimize legal consequences while ensuring that programs designed to help genuinely needy families were not abused. The house was sold in a foreclosure auction 3 months later for $260,000, significantly less than the mortgage balance my mother owed. The proceeds were insufficient to cover her debts, leaving her facing bankruptcy and the loss of credit access for years to come. The home improvements I had funded, which had briefly increased the property value, could not overcome the deterioration that had occurred since my departure. My mother eventually moved to a small apartment in a senior living complex where her housing costs are subsidized based on her legitimate income and financial need. The arrangement provides appropriate support for her age and health conditions. While ensuring that government resources are used properly, our relationship is cordial but distant, consisting of brief phone calls on holidays and occasional family updates. Tracy learned valuable lessons about financial responsibility and relationship choices through the crisis she had helped create. The experience of returning to an abusive relationship temporarily motivated her to develop job skills and support systems that eventually allowed her to establish independent housing for herself and her children. She completed a certified nursing assistant program and found stable employment at a local hospital, providing steady income and health benefits for her family. The extended family members who had judged me so harshly during the birthday party confrontation gradually learned the true facts about our financial arrangements through conversations with Grandma Helen, who had conducted her own investigation after becoming suspicious about the conflicting accounts. Uncle Frank offered a sincere apology and has become a reliable source of career advice and family support. Cousin Jessica deleted her social media posts about entitled millennials and publicly acknowledged that she had shared information without understanding the full situation. My own life has flourished in ways that would not have been possible while trapped in the toxic dynamic of my family home. The promotion to site supervisor that had been promised came through 6 months after my departure, along with a substantial salary increase that allowed me to move to a larger apartment and begin building genuine savings for future goals. The stress-related health issues that had been developing from months of family conflict resolved quickly once I was living in a peaceful environment. Most importantly, I met Sarah Chen at a company barbecue the following spring. Sarah is a structural engineer who works for the architectural firm that designed several of our construction projects, and our professional connection grew into a personal relationship built on mutual respect and honest communication. She brings intelligence, humor, and emotional stability to my life while appreciating the work ethic and family loyalty that nearly destroyed me when misdirected toward people who exploited those qualities. We have been dating for 8 months now, and our relationship feels fundamentally different from the family dynamics that had defined my adult life until that point. Sarah values my financial contributions because she contributes equally to our shared expenses, creating partnership rather than dependence. She supports my career ambitions while pursuing her own professional goals, and our disagreements are resolved through discussion rather than manipulation or emotional warfare. The house where I grew up has been purchased by a young family who are slowly renovating it with their own labor and resources. Driving past the property occasionally, I feel nostalgic about my childhood memories there, but no regret about leaving when I did. The structure is being restored with love and care by people who appreciate its potential, which seems like a fitting conclusion to my own complicated history with the place. The most profound lesson I learned through this experience is that family loyalty must be balanced with self-respect and personal boundaries. Supporting people you love is admirable and important, but enabling destructive behavior ultimately harms everyone involved. My mother's financial irresponsibility and manipulative behavior were made worse by my willingness to absorb the consequences of her choices without demanding accountability or change. Setting firm boundaries and walking away when they were violated was the most difficult thing I had ever done, but it was also the most necessary. The short-term pain of family conflict and social judgment was far preferable to the long-term damage that continued exploitation would have caused to my financial security, mental health, and personal development. The experience also taught me about the importance of documentation and legal preparation when dealing with complex family financial arrangements. Danny's legal guidance was crucial in helping me understand my rights and options, while the evidence I gathered provided protection against false accusations and manipulation. Having professional support during emotional crises can mean the difference between becoming a victim and successfully advocating for yourself. Finally, I learned that starting over is not always a loss, even when it involves leaving behind relationships and situations that had defined your identity for years. My new life is smaller in some ways, but infinitely more authentic and sustainable. The apartment I call home belongs to me in ways that my family house never did. And the relationships I am building are based on mutual choice rather than obligation or dependence. For anyone facing similar situations with family financial exploitation or emotional manipulation, my advice is to document everything. Seek professional guidance. And remember that protecting yourself is not selfish when dealing with people who refuse to respect reasonable boundaries. Family relationships should enhance your life rather than diminish it. And walking away from toxicity is sometimes the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. The courage to demand better treatment and the willingness to accept short-term consequences for long-term benefits changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. Standing up for yourself is never easy, but it is always worth it when the alternative is accepting a role as a victim in your own life story. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family members took advantage of your generosity or financial support? How did you handle the balance between loyalty and self-protection? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to help others find it and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about overcoming family conflicts and building healthier relationships. Sharing this video with friends or family members who might benefit from hearing about boundary setting and financial independence would mean a lot as well. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community that supports people through difficult family situations. I hope my experience can help others recognize when it is time to prioritize their own well-being over family expectations. Remember that you deserve respect and honesty in all your relationships, including those with family members. Take care, and I will see you in the next story.